We'll just let the stragglers kind of come in here. My name is Jason Merritt. I'm the marketing director at Forward Movement. I spoke a little earlier up at the pulpit here. And we're here to talk about breaking through the noise, storytelling, communications, and marketing. I'll let my colleague introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Miriam McKenney, and I work at Forward Movement. I'm the development director, and I also am a writer. And in my career before Forward Movement, I was a librarian for over 20 years, mostly doing children's librarianship, and I was a school librarian.
So one of the things, Miriam and I, we share a wall at Forward Movement, and so we are constantly in each other's office. We're laughing all the time, we're talking, we keep it loose. So we're expecting today to be no different. We hope it's loose. So we just kind of want this to be a conversation. We have a lot to say, but hopefully you have questions throughout, and you can just raise your hand, shout out, throw something at us, and that'll get our attention. One of the things that, so I said I'm the marketing director. Often when I'm talking about these kind of things, I use a lot of business speak and all. It's interesting because when Miriam and I start talking about these things, we get back and forth with each other. As she was saying, as the librarian, storyteller, writer, the things that she said it puts some things, it connects dots for me, things that I'm studying in marketing, things that I'm learning, everything from the psychology of how people respond to communication notes and how you can influence them and persuade them. Marketing is about persuasion in the end. And so we thought today that the best thing for us to do, since we're going to talk about storytelling and how it affects what you do in your communications, in your marketing, and in your presence in your own context, was to start with a story. And so Miriam's going to take us down that journey.
Okay, so in my librarian life, what I would do is hold the book like this and read it, and sometimes read upside down. Because I wanted you to be able to see the pictures, I'm not going to read it like that, and so that Jason can see where I am in the story and know when to change, I'm going to just hold it here on my lap. But this is a story that is over 500 years old, likely much older than that, comes from the Bini tribe in Africa, which is now modern-day Nigeria, and it is a story called Why the Sky is Far Away. In the beginning, the sky was very close to the earth. In that time, men and women did not have to sow crops and harvest them. They did not have to prepare soup and cook rice. The children did not have to carry water jugs from the stream or gather sticks for the fire. Anybody who was hungry just reached up, took a piece of the sky, and ate it. And it was delicious too. Sometimes the sky tastes like meat stew, sometimes like roasted corn, and sometimes like ripe pineapple. There was very little work to do, so people spent their time weaving beautiful cloth, carving handsome statues, and retelling tales of adventures. And there were always festivals to prepare for. The musicians practiced, the mask makers carved their masks in secret, and everywhere the children watched the preparations in wonder. The king of the land was called the Oba, and his court was magnificent. At the royal palace was a team of servants whose only work was to cut and shape the sky for royal ceremonies. But the sky was growing angry because people were wasteful. Most often, they took more than they could possibly eat and threw the leftovers onto garbage heaps. I'm tired of seeing myself soured and spoiled on every rubbish bin in the land, brooded the sky. So one morning at sunrise, the sky turned very dark. Thick black clouds gathered over the Oba's palace, and a great voice boomed from above. Oba, mighty one, your people have wasted my gifts. I am tired of seeing myself on heaps of garbage everywhere. I warn you, do not waste my gifts any longer, or they will no longer be yours. The Oba, in terror, sent messengers carrying the sky's warning to every corner of the land. In every village, people were told about the sky's unhappiness. Children were warned never to take a piece of sky unless they were truly hungry. People were very careful. at least for a while. Then the time arrived for the great festival of the year. It was the festival that celebrated the power of the Oba. The most important palace dancers performed all through the night, and the Oba himself, in ceremonial robes, danced for his subjects. By the fifth day, there was rejoicing in every home and on every street. The Oba knew, though, that with the dancing and the merriment, people might forget the sky's warning. So he made sure no one took more sky than he or she absolutely needed. Now, there was a woman in this kingdom who was never satisfied. She had 11 children, yet she felt her house was empty. She wore weighty coral necklaces that her husband had bought for her, and yet she still craved more. On the very last night of the celebration, Adese and her husband were invited to the Oba's palace. They danced and ate well past midnight. Ah, what an evening that was, Adese thought later in her own garden. How I wish I could relive tonight, the drumming, the riches, and the food I ate. She looked up at the sky, and hoping to taste again the cocoa yams and the meat stew the sky had offered, she took a huge piece to eat. But she had only finished 1/3 when she could swallow no more. "What have I done?" wailed Adese. "I cannot throw this away. Otolo," she screamed, calling her husband, "come finish this piece of sky for me." Her husband, exhausted from dancing and stuffed with sky he had eaten at the Oba's palace, could only take 2 bites. "Wake the children," screamed Adese. Now the children had spent all night at a masquerade and party after their dinner, and most of them were too full to even nibble at their mother's piece of sky. The neighbors were called, and the neighbors' neighbors were called, but Adese still held in her hand a huge chunk of sky. "Ah, what does it matter?" she said finally. "One more piece of sky in a rubbish heap." And just to make sure it didn't matter, she buried the leftover in a garbage bin at the back of her house. Suddenly, the ground shook with thunder. Lightning creased the sky above the Oba's palace, but no rain fell. "Oba, mighty one," boomed a voice from above, "your people have not treated me with respect. Now I will leave you and move far away." "But what will we eat?" cried the Oba. "How will we live?" "You must learn how to plow the land and gather crops and hunt in the forests," answered the sky. "Perhaps through your own labor, you will learn not to waste the gifts of nature." No one in the land slept very well that night. The rising sun uncovered the heads of men and women and children, peering over rooftops and through windows, straining to see if the sky really had left them. It truly had. It had sailed upward, far out of their reach. From that day onward, men and women and children had to grow their own food. They tilled the land and planted crops and harvested them. And far above them rested the sky, distant and blue, just as it does today. So this story is a story that in the times that storytellers would tell them, we didn't have picture books, we didn't have illustrations. We had men or women who would memorize these stories from the storytellers who taught it to them, and they were the keepers of these stories. So in this story, what kinds of lessons do you think people would be learning? You can just call this out. Don't waste.
Don't waste.
Exactly. Anything else that comes to mind in the moment? Exactly. People have questions, okay? That's what we do as people. We wonder and we ask questions. And stories are a way that in every culture that's ever been studied, people use stories for a lot of different reasons, and one of the primary reasons is to teach. As a library teacher, I would have teachers who would come to me and they would want a story on some crazy esoteric fact or animal, because sure, they could get an informational book about that, but that's not going to be as memorable to children as a story about that animal would be. So in this story, if people are wondering as they're walking for 5 hours, why do I have this jug of water on my head? Why do I have to do this? And they would ask these questions. Why do I hunt an animal for 8 or 9 hours? They would gather around the fire and they would hear the stories of their ancestors and of the people that came before them to try to answer those questions of why. So you have stories of why leopard has spots and why snakes, is on the ground and doesn't have legs, and things that they tried to give answers to things that now, in a lot of cases, we have scientific reasons why those things are true, but there's still a lot of mystery in our lives. I wonder, what is one of those mysteries? Could it be Jesus? So we use stories from the Bible every week, for a lot of us every day, to answer those why questions. Another thing that we know about stories is that it connects people. You all have your individual story, and then we have our story as Episcopalians. You have your story of where you fit in with your family. You have your story of where you fit in with your ethnic group. So all of those little bits and pieces that contribute to your story is also integral into the story of those other places. And so as we continue this conversation, I wanted to start with a story because I think everyone has that story that is your favorite, right? Anybody have a favorite story? And it doesn't have to be a book. I mean, mine might be about 20 picture books, but yours doesn't have to be. It can be a movie. It can be a family story, something that's been passed down. Does anyone want to say something that's your favorite? What's yours? It is from a story. That's a wonderful story. Anyone else have a favorite that they'd like to share? Maybe from your childhood? Yes.
Anne of Green Gables.
Anne of Green Gables. Okay. Anyone have a favorite Bible story that you love to go back to over and over again, or favorite psalm? What's yours? Okay. Joseph. Mm-hmm. I couldn't hear you. That's good. Nice. So the things about those stories that connect us are the reasons why stories are so important. Another important part about stories is that they help us collect a cultural memory. So, you know the story of, I have a lot of cultural stories in my family of things that my family experienced, things that are particular about African American people, and it's important for us to continue to pass those down. 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, let me stop and say, one of the things I studied when I was in college and graduate school was Native American studies and Native American stories and African stories. And fortunately, one of the things that the government got right as far as our dealings with Native Americans back in the early 1900s is that there were people who went around to the tribes and talked with the storytellers and wrote down those stories, both in the original language and translated to English, because a lot of those storytellers were dying, and they wanted to capture that. Thank goodness. So in doing that, we have a lot of these stories written down, but again, these were stories that were not written down. These were stories that were told. So we want to, the reason that I believe that we long for story is because story is what holds us together. I mean, I don't know where I would be without this, not only my own personal story, but my family story, my faith story. My dad's an Episcopal priest, so that's a huge part of my life. And all of the little pieces of your life make up your story. Think about when people die. One of the things that we do as a family is we write an obituary. And so you think about that person's life and all of the little pieces of their life. And sometimes it doesn't seem like things are going to match up. but at the end, this is what you're trying to do is tell the story of someone's life in about 3 or 4 paragraphs. That's not easy to do, but it's important to do that. And then when people come to that funeral or they come to that memorial, they want to read that story. They want to know who that person was. They want to be able to connect with that person in some way.
Yeah, a quick anecdote about storytelling. So before I came to Forward Movement, I worked at Canoga Camp Conference Center in North Carolina. And the camp there every summer, I'd go over there here and there to take photos and video, record some of the kids. And we had all the things that you would expect at a camp: climbing walls, hiking trails, the lake, canoeing, all of those type of things. But one of the most beloved programs, and it had been going on for 20 years. And I don't mean that like the camp counselors who had grown up there, that it was their beloved program, so they forced the kids into it. It wasn't that kind of a program, but they brought in an Appalachian folk storyteller. And one night, his name was Bad Hair. I think he got that in the 70s when he had bad hair. And so he would sit just on the deck overlooking the lake, and I can't tell you how surprised I was that these kids who had been running around and they were in an environment where they were encouraged to be very active and going, would sit still and listen. And he was captivating, this idea of the storyteller. Miriam's a very good storyteller. I warned her that I was maybe going to sit down here and look at her like she was telling a story at the library, but I held back.
Thank you for that.
So those type of things started getting me thinking. Now, the storytelling is a big buzzword right now in the marketing field. A lot of people are talking about that. The reason is because marketing has been fractured. We've become a society that is so overly connected that the idea of authority, there's mistrust now. And so the idea of top down, we have a message, we're going to throw it down at you, and you just take it. You accept it. There's something that's changing now where people need that explanation a little bit more. And so a lot of the studies that are getting into this right now are talking about what psychologically is happening when people are receiving stories. And so I'm just going to run through a few things, and this gets into both the emotions that you can elicit through stories, the hormones that it'll release into your brain, and also what those hormones do for people when they're flowing through your brain. So the first emotion that stories can elicit and that you should elicit, we'll kind of get into the more getting involved and actually doing this in a little while, but is humor. Humor is a very good aspect for storytelling. Somebody said yesterday, make them laugh or make them cry, The reason is because humor can release endorphins. And endorphins, this is what it does for you. It makes people feel more comfortable, more relaxed, more focused. It's often called the pain reducer hormone. It's euphoric. Another is suspense with a resolution, the climax of the movie. When that happens, your brain releases dopamine. And what dopamine does for you is it helps you feel more focused. It enhances your memory and recall, which is very important because all of the other things that you put around that story, if you're trying to slightly weave in a message that through storytelling, then people are that dopamine flowing into their brain is gonna help them with memory and recall of that, and it builds motivation. And motivation is so important when you're trying to get someone to do whatever. In the marketing field, it could be buy your widget or, take your services. In the church, it could be come to church. It could be become part and active in the parish, tithe, or any of those other things. So suspense with a resolution activates dopamine in the brain. Another emotion is empathy. We all know this. Everyone who hears, obituaries, the storytelling that happens, when somebody passes and the family gathers together and starts telling stories, that gets oxytocin flowing in the brain. And that makes you trust people. It makes you bond more. It makes you just generally feel more human. You feel more generous. And you also feel more relaxed, which I think we could all use a little bit more. So empathy is a very important part of storytelling. The other is pride. Pride releases serotonin, and serotonin makes people feel happy, loyal, loving. So those 4 hormones, this is the physiological thing that is happening when we're hearing stories. We've known forever that stories really matter for us, but we're not totally, we're just kind of getting the science behind it of what it's actually physically doing to your body and how that later on helps you recall all of that. Trust the people who were telling you that story. So that's why a lot of organizations, companies, businesses have all brought in storytellers. They're bringing in people who know how to craft, an arc narrative that really gets people on an emotional journey.
Let me say something real quick that I forgot.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what I do when I'm talking. I forget what I'm supposed to say.
This is what it's like in our office.
So I forget what I'm supposed to say.
It really is.
I did a lot of studying with storytelling, but it's been 30 years ago. So I said, let me see what's been going on. Get on the internet and find some current research. And I was reading this article that was in the Atlantic magazine that was about some people who were studying this hunter-gatherer tribe in the Philippines called the Acta. And a title of the article was The Desirability of Storytellers. And so what this group found out was they were asking everybody in the tribe and also everybody who had been studying the tribe who were the most important people in the group. And again, this is a hunter-gatherer group. And everyone, the results were that the storyteller was the most important person. And they were really surprised by that. And they kind of went back and did it again. They were like, let's just make sure we did this right. And they started asking more questions of why. And, even more important than the main hunter, even important than that person, yes. Because the storyteller is the person that, again, is bringing that group together, doing all of the things that Jason just described, and again, is that cultural, historic memory of that group. And that is more important than food. That is food for a lot of people.
Cool. All right, so now we kind of thought we'd get into a little bit of application for this. So when we're talking about storytelling, we're all storytellers. We all do it every day, all the time. Even when we don't know it, if you don't know something, your brain starts to fill it in. If you don't know it, you start to make up stories. I think there was a study, I'm going to get this stat wrong, but a high percentage of people, 60-70% of people, when you're just thinking about whatever, you're inventing stories. If you're driving and you're listening, you're not listening to a podcast or the radio or something like that. You're making up stories in your head. You're explaining things. You're maybe you're thinking about the story that maybe just happened and how that would have played out differently. So we're all storytellers, but even our organization is a storyteller. And I don't just mean that you write blog posts or that you update your Facebook page. You're telling a story through your very presence. Everything you do, everything you touch, the tone that you take with people, it tells a story. And if you are actively trying to get people to engage with you, you can either control that story and try to guide it, you can be the storyteller, or someone else will do it for you. They'll fill it in. And so it's so important for us to be clear with ourselves first so that we can then go out. So I thought for a few minutes here we could just everybody can take a little mental break and start thinking about some things. So I wanted to ask you, you can either, you can talk amongst yourselves, get ideas, you could start texting this to yourself, you could just think about it. But if you were going to talk about your church, your organization, why do you matter? Why do you exist? And I don't mean the big picture of why we exist. We know that.
Yeah, one of the things we talked about over and over again is, we made the thing about Jesus.
Yeah.
Let's just all have an understanding that the reason that we're all doing this and the reason that we're doing this workshop, the reason that we're here at Evangelism Matters is because we love Jesus and we care about Jesus and we want people to get into deeper relationship with Jesus, and we're working on that process of being more inviting and being more engaging about that. So just so that you know that that's always what we're talking about. No matter what we're saying, that's the underlying message. So, yeah, that.
Perfect. So, yeah, back to that. Why do you matter? Why do you exist? And I think the better way to think about this, and this is maybe the question that you can ponder now for a minute or two, and talk amongst yourselves, try to write something. We'll ask people to share a little bit, is what would be missing from your neighborhood, your community, or your city if you just vanished? And I don't mean a building, I don't mean, a group of people. What would be missing from that community if you just vanished today? And so take a few minutes and then maybe we'll ask for some volunteers. So hopefully we've got some people.
And I'm a former teacher, so I will just call on you.
There you go.
Be ready.
You're in trouble.
If you don't raise your hand, I will just point.
You nailed it? All right.
So you're up first?
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and bring it back. So Miriam and I we just challenged ourselves to take part in that, which we hadn't done beforehand. And I think it was kind of telling because it didn't take us very long because we talked about this. So,
I just had to check again.
Oh, okay. So one of the things, we were just talking about forward movement. And how many people are familiar with forward movement? How many people are not familiar with forward movement? Great. All right, awesome. So Forward Movement historically has been known for producing Forward Day by Day, daily devotional since 1935. Over the years, we've evolved into other content production, books. Now we do a lot of digital things. We do apps, we do blogs. We do things like Lent Madness. You remember I talked about humor, how that gets memory in? We do things like that, fun things. Conferences. We do things, help with conferences like this. And so we were just discussing what would be missing. What would be missing if Forward Movement vanished? And I've thought about this, and I didn't actually answer this question. Later on, we're gonna talk about this little story that we have. But we had a couple come to Forward Movement, and the woman who was there, she said, I feel every morning when I'm reading day by day that I have a friend, that I have a guide there. And so for us, we could say, if Forward Movement vanished, well, 500,000 copies of Forward Day by Day wouldn't be printed every quarter. The third floor of the diocesan building in downtown Cincinnati would be available. But that's not it. Our why is that we're that friend, that guide, that we are that conduit for all. I mean, we have amazing writers. Miriam's one of them, but we have dozens and dozens of writers around the church who are friends, who are helpful on that daily basis. And that's the memory that those people have of our organization. Sure, they have those other things as well. They know where to find us. They know our website, hopefully the website address. But it's really that they would be missing that friend, that guide. And so that's sort of what we were just talking about.
So what about you?
Anyone want to go? So I think that throughout that exercise, what we kind of started to hear there was the uniqueness, that we all have our own context, which is the perfect transition into that everybody has their own story. Every group of people, every community has their own story, and it evolves. You build it. But it's important, and I would encourage you to maybe, you're fine. Okay. I would encourage you to maybe take that exercise and take those questions. What would be missing if you weren't there? Take that back with you. Get a little core group of people, a brain trust, and pray on it, ponder it, really think into it. And I think that those were some great examples already, that it's not, too often we can get into the nuts and bolts of what we're doing, and we forget that we still need to be weaving that story constantly throughout everything that we do. So it's important because when you start with that story, the big story we'll call it, if you start with the big story, everything else flows from that. Every blog post, every Facebook update, anything, it's going to flow from that. And it's important for you to get that right first, because nowadays, as we've heard so many times throughout this conference and every conference nowadays, authenticity is important. We're more connected to each other. We have access to different ideas. We have access to different, somebody said, you can get that anywhere. We have access to different options more than ever. And so that authenticity, it's so important to name your story, to name that big tale that you're weaving in the world, and own it, and let everything flow from it and be authentic to it. Because, pardon the language, but we have the most evolved BS detectors ever nowadays. We can spot it right away, particularly the younger that you get and the more you get into digital natives, with millennials and the generation coming afterwards. That it's going to be important that whatever that story is, having confidence in it, and often with the word authenticity, I kind of translate that into consistent. It can get muddled, but if you're consistently doing the same thing, would you be doing it if no one was watching? Would you be doing it if there was only one person in the room? That's the type of authenticity that you need. It's not, it can get muddled when you just start throwing around words, but I think of it as consistency, and that can flow out to everything else that you're doing.
And I think of it, when we talked about this, and, I talk about authenticity, and people who know me know what I mean by that, because I'm the keep it real person. I'm a realist in general, but I just believe in just being not rudely blunt, but just tell the truth and be who you are and tell the story that you really need to tell and be real about it. And working with kids for a long time, kids can, and if you have kids and have worked with kids, you know this. Kids can tell right away, okay? They can tell, and even they might not tell you that they know that you're faking or you're adding or you're sugarcoating it or saccharin coating it, even worse, but they know it. And they live with that, and that goes into their heart, and they carry it forward with them, and they begin to learn who to trust. and what to believe. And so if your organization is working on getting to your authentic story, that means you need to tell the real story of what you are really doing. So if you are adding stuff to your story that isn't really what you're doing, and then you invite someone to come and they actually come to your church and they don't see that you're doing that, you have lost it. And with this younger generation, as you were just talking about digital natives, stories are immediate. So if someone tells that story, or if you tell it and somebody sees through your stuff, they're going to, what we call start throwing shade. They're going to start, putting a cloud over your story, and that takes a lot of work to undo that. So you just don't want to go down that road.
Absolutely. So our example, we're going to bring it back to the Forward Movement here, and I'll let Miriam tell the story of this wonderful couple here. But I'll start. So every morning at Forward Movement, we believe in daily prayer. We believe in that habit of holy meditation. And so every morning at 10 a.m., wherever you are, 10 a.m. East time, we're around that conference room table and we're reading Forward day by day as a community. So that is us living into our story. And I mean, our marketing team, we share these photos. We've got bills to pay and things. So we want people to know we're living this. We're out there, so this couple is great.
This was a story of a couple. I can think of Diane suddenly. Greg and Diane Peacock from Oklahoma. So they emailed our office and said, we're coming to Cincinnati and we're coming to see you. We want to come and see you. Forward Movement has been a big part of our lives through the years. It's been a big part of our marriage. They read it together as they start their day, and they do their devotion and they pray together. I mean, this was just, we're just always amazed by this and blessed and thankful. So Jane, who is here on the left with the Forward Movement swag shirt on, loves to give tours of the office. So she was there to give a tour and gave them a swag bag full of Forward Movement goodies, and they wanted to come and join us at our prayer time. And I'm not always at prayer time. I will just admit to you, I'm not always there, but at 10 o'clock every day, I pray. And I pray for God to put, God's hands and heart and through Jesus and the Spirit on whoever needs prayer that has requested prayer. But we get a lot of prayer requests, and if you ever need prayer, you can go to our website and put your intercessions or your thanksgivings in, and we have folks who every single day do this. It's not like you can do it and say, do this every day forever. You have to do it every day, and there are people who do this, and we're happy to pray for you. So I was the author that month, last July, and they wanted to meet me. So I got an email saying, be sure to be there for a prayer time on Monday. I don't usually go into the office on Monday, so I was, excited to meet them. And they told this amazing story. It was just such a witness. And she talked about the power of the meditations and just the fact that if we weren't there, she's the one who said, if you weren't there, I wouldn't have that friend. We would, you're a friend every day with us. And, it was one of those cases, as often happens in the church, where we were much more highly favored and blessed, I feel, than they were. They felt just so thankful and so grateful to come and spend time with us and be there with us during our prayer time. But, when they left, we were all so lifted up from that. I mean, that spirit stayed with us, and I was so thankful for that. Because being an organization who, I'm used to working with the public. And so now when, we're in our office and we're doing our thing, and sometimes we can feel a little disconnected from folks, but thank goodness people write to us and they let us know how God is working through their lives and how they are getting closer and closer to Jesus through the work that we do. And so that's the kind of feedback that we want. That's part of our story.
Yeah, and I think the important thing about this moment was that we didn't have to invent it. We didn't hear that they were coming into town, and we were like, all right, somebody clean out the conference room. We're going to sit down.
Somebody tidied up the table.
Who's going to read whatever? It was natural. It was just what we did. Somebody grabbed the little prayer dish where we all put our prayer requests in. Somebody printed off the prayers that come in through our website. We did it like we do it every morning, and so they were able to be there and witness authenticity. We didn't have to invent it. So it's that, again, would you do it if no one was watching?
And Hugo, our colleague Hugo Olaez, who always has his selfie stick, was able to capture this picture with them.
Great. So we thought we'd maybe talk a little bit, kind of run through some contextualizing this, maybe some applications, some ideas to get going. We've got about 15 minutes left.
Yeah.
So we'll run through that. So one of the things about stories is repetition. Repetition is important. Both, well, for many reasons, we like it, but also secretly we're kind of craving. Remember those hormones that were dropped into your brain when you heard that story that you really loved that first time I was talking about? You're craving those. I mean, like some of these hormones you can get through illicit drugs, which is not the good way to get them. You know, so you crave those, and so that's why you want to hear that story over and over again. And kids want to hear that.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
and think of songs. I mean, songs are stories too. So if you have your favorite songs and you have it on repeat, that's you needing to hear that story again and again.
Absolutely. So it is sort of, I always encourage churches and organizations to be rhythmic with whatever you're posting or whatever you're putting out there, because people, I mean, nowadays it's sort of, people are checking their Facebook feeds or whatever, and so it's good for you to just be present that day. But if you can get a rhythm going, if you can assign a specific day of the week that they might expect a story, then that leads them to the point where they're going to start thinking about it the night before. You need a good storyteller. You need a good writer. You can't just wing it. But it is important to have a little bit of rhythm behind it. Also, nowadays, visual storytelling is more important than ever. We've been talking about how, anthropologically, cultures throughout all time have told stories, but it was at first oral tradition, and then we started writing it down. Well, now we've got pictures, and a picture's worth 1,000 words. It can tell so much. Our brains will fill in the other information and tell the whole story around it. So video is even more important nowadays. And it doesn't have to be a huge production. We're surrounded by a lot of production. Bravo to the AV team here. But it doesn't have to be. I mean, a cell phone has a pretty good camera on it and a decent enough microphone that you could start asking people in your congregation questions. Why did you come here? What was the best experience that you've had so far in your time here? What was one moment that made you cry? What was one moment that made you laugh? What was one moment that made you cringe or made you feel empathy for the people around you? And have them tell the story. That can be very, very important. And doing that through visual media is more important now today, both because we've moved on to digital media, and that is very much driven by visual nowadays. But you can absolutely see that there's a difference in the way that people retain that information when you show them. Don't just tell me, show me. That's a very important thing nowadays.
And you want to, certainly, there are going to be people in your congregations and in your organizations who are going to do this and want to do this. And our advice to you is invite them to do it. Don't just wait for them to say, can I do this? Or is it okay if I have my phone out during worship? If you want to tell the story of what's going on in your organization or in your congregation, if you believe in the good news of Jesus Christ and want people to see how that works in your church, then that means people are going to need to take pictures during a service. That means that it needs to be okay, and they need to have the ability to share that on your Facebook, on your Instagram, or wherever they need to share it. And you also, back to the Facebook thing, you know how it is in your Facebook feed where the same organization is telling something, or they posted a couple of days, but it's the exact same thing, so it's all lumped together? That's completely defeating the purpose of what you're trying to do. So the more people that you engage in telling the story of your ministry, that's going to show up separately. That's not going to show up all in one big clump. So that's more opportunity for more people to tell that story, and the more people feel invited to tell the story of your ministry, that's part of their story now. And they're going to be more willing to get to that final crucial stage of inviting.
Yeah, and it's important to highlight people, not program. We're humans. We're social creatures. Even introverts like us, we like people sometimes. So you really want to show people over program. That's important. Actually, you were to tell about Victor in that church.
Yes. So our friend Victor, who you've seen he's on the planning team, told me a story while we were here that he was working with a church in Chicago, and they were struggling. There was a big, beautiful church, maybe not as beautiful as this, but it was a beautiful church, and it was shrinking, and they couldn't figure out what to do. And they were showing pictures of the church, the gorgeousness, and they were showing empty pews. So he started working with them to start doing this concept that Jason was just talking about of talking to the people and getting those little stories and maybe show them sitting in a pew, but not showing a big thing of empty pews and taking the focus off of the building and putting it on the people and the stories that they had experienced, and the numbers started to grow. And I've seen that in other cases. I know Rochelle, when she was a communicator in our Diocese of Southern Ohio, I can remember being at diocesan convention and seeing a video of individual people telling their story. And I mean, I still remember that. That had to be, what, like 6 years ago? Yeah. So it was very powerful. To me, I can't get enough of seeing people tell why they've come to a place that they want to stay. That's something I like to hear.
Especially in an age of mistrust, because that's disruptive for us right now. You know, it's disruptive to hear somebody of why they want to stay in the church, those kind of things. And that can be very, you know, it kind of breaks through the noise. It gets you there. Yeah. Another thing is just check with your stakeholders, I'll call them, but check with your people regularly. Ask them, you know. Like we talked about that little brain trust you might do that experiment with and talk through it. Check back frequently. Are we still being true? Are we still telling the right story? Where have we not? Because the reality is that you're going to mess up. I mean, with social media, it's great because you can experiment a little bit more. You can kind of push the envelope. Certain platforms more than others, but you can sort of push the envelope. So you can go back and say, where have we failed? Where have we stepped a little bit outside the line? Where have we nailed it? Where has it been perfect? And if you can start asking those questions regularly, then it creates a community of people who are all talking about this story because you're all weaving it together. So that's important.
I'm going to cut a bunch of other stuff that I was going to say, and one thing I do want to highlight is the asset map. I'll tell you the truth. The first time I heard about the asset map and I saw it, I was totally confused. I understood the concept of it, but I just found it challenging. It was a little difficult to use and difficult to understand. Now, it is so easy. It is amazing. A couple of days ago at the Catalyst, raise your hand if you were at the Catalyst Day. Okay, so my Catalyst, back me up on this. Wasn't it easy? Come on. So this is a way that you can tell your story, the story of your church. I'm talking about, I do a hike and pray with my youth group. Once a month, we take a hike together and we do evening prayer at the end. That is something that I can put in the asset map separately from any other event that we do, because if anybody in the Cincinnati area is looking for a church that does a hike and pray and they look up hike, my thing is going to show up. So I just want to encourage you to check out the asset map and start to tell your story that way. Yes? Okay. Yes. So it's on the Episcopal Church website, and forgive me for not having that URL. So mistake, number 20. But if you look up Episcopal Asset Map, trust me, you'll find it. It'll be easy to find, and the interface is very easy. Anyone can update this. You don't need to go and get somebody's permission. There's somebody on the back end that's going to approve everything. So as long as you're not putting something crazy on there, then it's going to get approved. And it's a really wonderful way to help, spread the good news about what you're doing in the church. I'm done there.
EpiscopalAssetMap.org.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Excellent.
The last thing, my last point was, is that when you're telling a story often, and I see it way too often, a church or an organization of business makes themselves the hero of the story. And really what you want to be doing is you want to be inviting your listener to become the hero of their own story. That can be, there can be a lot of reasons for that, the mistrust, authority, all that kind of stuff. But you're just the guide. You're the keeper of the story. Ryan uses that all the time. And so if you ask them to take a stand in their own story, and you invite them to be the hero, we've all got an ego, so we're gonna react to that a little bit better. If you just position yourself as the hero and, come on, little partner, you can sidle up along next to us, that might not work as well. So I encourage you to invite them to be the hero of their own story. It's a good example.
I got one.
Good.
Okay. So in our organization, the good thing I get to do is give stuff away for free. And so I'm the development director. I'm a fundraiser. I will tell you quite frankly, when I started doing this work, it is really, really hard for me. I mean, I was a librarian. I did stuff for free all the time. I don't want to ask you to give me money, right? But what I learned is that people want to be invited. A lot of times people are looking for a reason to help somebody else, and no one asks them. And so you're giving someone a gift, and you're honoring them when you ask them. But it's how you ask. So we get a lot of letters from inmates and folks who receive our stuff for free, thanking us and telling us how that publication has changed their lives. They're in a cell, and they're looking for a relationship with Jesus. They're looking for ways to have God in their life. And so when someone writes and tells us that, that's an easy thing for me to pass on to our donors. I'm not in this. Forward Movement is just the conduit between this person who is in need and this person who has something to give, and making that connection and making that happen. And that's the story that I love to tell. So that's an example.
And one thing that Miriam did with that story that I really loved is shared photos of the letter, of the actual letters, handwritten. Because remember, that really shows that the layer of it, that's how information gets out of jails. That adds to this whole story, and I really thought that was because you're seeing someone's handwriting. Remember that personal connection, and so it kind of connected it really well. I thought that was a good example.
I wanted to invite my friend to tell this story.
Totally.
Over another time. So obviously, I mean, if you've been here this long, you know about Invite, Welcome, Connect. Even if you weren't here for that plenary, invitation is the part of evangelism that we often struggle with, right? Catalyst, back me up on this. Where are my catalysts? Come on, Catalyst. You know it's true. So, I mean, I have a hard time. I grew up in this church, and I don't have a lot of conversations with my friends about their church life and where they're going to church. It's something I'm working on. But my new friend, Kevin Beasley, has a story that I'd like for him to share about all of that. Share it, Kevin.
In 2 minutes or less.
2 minutes or less.
My name's Kevin Beasley. I'm a priest at All Saints Episcopal Church. I'm the curate there in New Albany, Ohio, just outside of Columbus. And it was a particularly bad Tuesday. It was a bad day to be a priest. And it was just filled with craziness. And after a late night meeting, Father Jason, the rector, and I said, we got to eat. And since we're both Italians, we said, we got to eat pizza. So we left to find some good Italian comfort food. And we ended up at a place about 5 miles away. It's called Brigada's, which in Italian is actually ghetto. It's called Brigada. So we went to Brigada's. And we walked in the restaurant, and a little bald-headed Italian guy came up. Hello, fathers. How are you? And he began to bring us just pasta and bread and pizza and the sausage with peppers. Oh, the sausage and peppers. You should try this place. And he said, if you get a chance, can I tell you a story? And I said, yeah, of course. We'd love to hear it. And he said, a few years ago, I owned an Italian pizza place called Gino's. And he said, we were in business for a really long time. And he said the business was doing about $800 a day at its peak. And he said crime was getting bad and things were not really making it a safe place. People were being robbed. And he said, we ended up doing $80 a day business. And I just couldn't keep the business open anymore, so I closed it. He said, I had no money, I didn't have a job, so I moved into an apartment. And I was trying to figure out what to do with my life. My son was serving in Afghanistan overseas. And every time the phone would ring for my son, I always was worried. He said, my son called one day. He said, I had 2 cigarettes and a cup of coffee. And he said, my son called, and I said, are you okay? And he said, Dad, I'm fine, but I'm worried about something. He said, what's the matter? He said, every year, we've always closed down the pizza shop at Christmas, and we celebrated as a family. What are we going to do this Christmas? And he said, son, don't worry about it. It's going to be okay. He said, I hung up the phone. He said, I got a little upset and a little weepy. And I said, I went outside and sat on the front porch. And he said, I could see at a distance a man walking towards me. And he had something in his hand. And as he got closer, I realized that he was coming to me. And he walked up to me and said, I don't know you, but I wanted to give you this bread. And he says, who are you? He says, I'm just a guy in the neighborhood. but I wanted to give you this bread. He says, okay, thanks. And as the guy turned to walk away, he says, you should check out a new place called Brigada's. He said, what? What is it? He said, Brigada. He said, okay, fine. You think the story gets better, right? No, it doesn't. It gets worse. Now this guy is moving in with his family because he can't afford the apartment anymore. Still can't find a job. He's got nothing. He said it was his birthday, October 18th. He had $6 in his pocket and decided that I'm going to go get some pizza at this place called Brigada's. He walks in the restaurant and he sees a husband and wife working behind the counter. And he says, it's my birthday. I've got $6. How much pizza can I buy for $6? And I said, I'll make you a small pie and, happy birthday. And then he stops and says, I think I know you. And he says, no, you don't know me. He says, I'm pretty sure that I do. He says, did you used to own Gino's Pizza? He says, yeah, I did. The owner of the Brigada's pulls out his wallet and takes out a card with his name and phone number on it. And he says, I'm supposed to call you. He says, are you Roz? He says, yeah, I'm Roz. He says, I'm supposed to call you. He says, for what? Well, my wife and I, we're going to Florida, and we need someone to take care of the business. Would you take care of the restaurant? And Roz starts to well up a little bit in tears because now he realizes this guy is offering him a job, and he says, you don't even know how much this means to me. You're offering me a job, and I've got nothing. Thank you. He says, no, you don't understand. I'm not offering you a job. I want you to take the business. And he said that night on his birthday, on October 18th, he had the keys to a restaurant, all of the food, all of the finances. It was his. And so we asked him that night, I said, Roz, when's the last time you've been to church? He said, it's been a long time, Father. When's the last time you've had communion? He said, a really long time. We're coming back Monday. We're bringing you Jesus. And he wept. And he held on to us and cried because someone cared. And then even more so, when we left with our $66 bill, he said, you guys don't pay. We said, we're paying because we're here because we love you, not because we want free food. And we paid, and we went back Monday. We had communion together. We blessed his restaurant, and he was in church that very Sunday. And I told this story to the congregation. And with his permission, I said, I know the story sounds crazy, but there's the guy that owns the restaurant. There's Roz. And he wept, and the people wept. And I can tell you that there was nothing as holy as watching him come down the aisle of All Saints to receive Jesus. And I hugged him, and I said, welcome home. You're back. This is your church. Jesus loves you, and we're here for you. That's evangelism.
Thank you. So what you need to know about that is I just met Kevin, yesterday? Okay? So my good friend Jason Pratty, who works with him, told me this story 2 nights ago. So this was not a planned thing, okay? This is how we know Jesus is here and that Jesus thinks that stories are important. But I wanted them to tell that story because it just hits everything that we talked about and the invitation. You can work on your story, you can tell your story, you can make it great, but if you do not invite people into that, it really isn't going to mean what you want it to mean.
Amen.
Amen.
All right.
So we appreciate you listening. We appreciate you sitting on these hard pews. I know that they're hard. It's like nap time. It's this afternoon. So we have our emails here. If you want to follow up with us, we'll likely be hanging out over at the Forward Movement booth. But thank you so much for being here and for sharing your stories with us.